Cieran Farrell is a long-serving member of ASSAP and is currently our appointed secretary. Ciaran also serves as a council member for the Society for Psychical Research, as well as the SPR's Spontaneous Cases Committee. A lifetime of unusual phenomenon has installed resilience, along with methods of approaches to investigation. He has a joint honours degree in chemistry and physics, as well as a study of philosophy of science in his cap, as well as being a trained private investigator. Ciaran takes a crime scene-like forensic approach to paranormal cases, akin to his boyhood hero Sherlock Holmes. He employs a deduction method, as well as a combination of modern instruments and mediumistic techniques. Tonight, our ASSAP webinar guest will be Cieran Farrell, with a focus on cold spots, an empirically based exploration of preternatural cold spots. Cieran Farrell, my friend, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you. And I'd like to wish everyone a very warm welcome to the chilly subject of cold spots. So, shall I begin, or you?
You certainly can do. Yeah, feel free to roll.
Okay. So this splash screen is something that I chose because it has a particular meaning for me. The reason I chose the Edgar Allan Poe quote for this talk is because one way or another I have made cold spots a bit of a life study. Therefore, the quote had a certain resonance for me, as I have indeed spent a long time and very many hours, and a great many occasions staring into cold spots and wondering about what lies within, hoping that they may be connected to some form of afterlife or existence after bodily death, or fearing in some ways that they might be so. It is true to say that not everyone can sense or experience cold spots. Most people can in one way or another, but people often ascribe the effect a cold spot has on them to different causes. Perhaps they had a bad turn or feeling, or experienced this horrible thing that we can have sometimes, that somebody walked over my grave, or that their stomach had been playing up, or their brain or body just experienced some kind of glitch, or perhaps there was a sudden and unexpected cold breeze or whatever. So, introduction, which is more or less what I've done, and the structure. So I'd like to make an introduction to the topic of cold spots by saying that one way or another I've had to live with them from an extremely young age, and through various family homes, and also through the homes that I've lived in as well. One of the questions I've often asked myself when I was young was, do these cold spots follow me around, or am I attracted to them in some way? So do I follow them? In the beginning, I was a passive recipient of the cold spot experience, but soon I became an explorer and imagined myself as a pioneer like Captain Kirk, boldly going into the darkness of the Preternatural to find answers. The Preternatural being something which is physical, but nobody can figure out exactly what it is because it's an unknown physical sort of phenomena. Some of these things and the answers that I found through my research and explorations are what this talk is about. So I had a lot of problems when I was a child, and I regularly bunked off school. I was eventually put in a special school as a result of those problems, one way or another. But I gained a joint honours degree in chemistry and physics, although I was not able to complete my PhD due to funding problems and the merger of my college with others within London University. It was my experience of the paranormal and the desire to find out how cold spots and other phenomena worked that led me into wanting to study science in the first place. And that was, in a sense, my own personal starship enterprise. The reason why this is important to me personally and is relevant to this talk is because, again, as I said, I used to bunk off school, but I used to hang out in old abandoned buildings, old hospital buildings, which were haunted. And that gave me a lot of opportunities to carry out experiments with ghosts and with cold spots and to try and figure out the relationship between the two. A little while later, I went with my family and another family to stay in an extremely haunted house for a summer holiday. This led to a great deal of paranormal and poltergeist activity in our holiday home, and that followed myself back to my family home, the other family to their family home, and me to boarding school, because I went to the boarding school straight after going on the haunted holiday. So what I'd like to look at is, well, something about myself, which is more or less what I've been describing, some thoughts about science and beyond, which we're coming to, and a proposed working definition of cold spots, and therefore the empirical characteristics and behavior of cold spots which go to make up this sort of general definition and description of them. So my approach is a combined one involving both physical instrumentation and mediumistic methods of inquiry, and that's what I'll be looking into tonight. I hope by these means to be able to provide you with a rough empirical working definition of what cold spots actually are and how they might be studied in the future in the field, as well as in a more academic setting. So, again, my basic approach here is to try to bridge the gap between the experiences that people have on a human level and the expectations of science and the scientific method, and how you can draw the two together. So the basic problem with exploring or investigating the paranormal on the ground in a practical way is this gap between human experience and what we can actually objectively measure with instruments and so on. We search for a means of finding objective evidence in the paranormal beyond the witness statements of people who've had a paranormal encounter of one sort or another. This objective evidence would therefore be independent of personal viewpoint or opinion of the observer and quantifiable, so that we could build up a picture in numbers and ultimately in mathematical equations, which would provide us with a complete scientific model of the phenomena. Now, I'm used to this sort of business in physics because that's exactly what you do in physics, and also in chemistry, which has become a highly mathematical science. Science has brought us the modern world, but all the science in the world cannot hope to duplicate the plunge of a diver into a lake of cold, icy water. Well, not yet anyway. And that's exactly the point. How can you bridge that gap? How can you make science describe a human experience? And how can you take a human experience and make it scientific? So, coming on to the subject of cold spots themselves, a cold spot is a very specific location. Indeed, it can be large, it can be small, but most often it's the size of a person, which is interesting in itself. So, there is a collection of symptoms which usually accompany the sensation of cold. There is an odd sort of nausea and a sensation of sickness. The nausea is a little bit like going over a humpback bridge very fast in a car. One feels as if one's stomach has been physically displaced and has moved within one's own body. This, of course, is not true, but the sensation suggests this, together with a secondary sensation when the two are correctly reunited. Hairs on the back of the neck and on the arms and in other anatomical locations can stand up, and one can experience, generally speaking, goosebumps. It is like and yet different from experiencing fear and anxiety, but there is no obvious cause, no specific object of the fear or anxiety that one feels. Or alternatively, people are scared, sometimes to the point of being terrified by some unknown and often unseen threat posed to them by the cold spot. This anxiety, fear or dread, or nameless terror, is out of all proportion to the danger that exists. This is all part of the cold spot experience. There is also usually a sort of sick, nauseating, spinning type of headache. This accompanies the stomach churning, and one feels as if there is a great weight or depression pressing down on one's head, which dampens one's ability to think and to act and react. One feels as if the ground in front of you or even under your feet is about to open up and swallow you. And there we are. This set of symptoms, once experienced, becomes quite recognizable as being like nothing else one has previously experienced. They are unique to the situation and so also to cold spots and cold spot phenomena. Now, first thing is to try and explain a cold spot not by what it is, but what it is not. So I've given you a brief description of what it is. What it isn't is, in that sense, it's something that cannot be adequately explained or accounted for in terms of changes to the natural physical environment, such as drafts, convection currents, airflows, and so on. So you have to look around and investigate a room to see if any of these things would account for a cold spot. And if they don't, well, you probably do have a proper cold spot there. If, on the other hand, you find, oh, well, it was just a breeze from a window and so on, then you can eliminate that from inquiries by closing the window or whatever it might be. So the other point here is that cold spot phenomena are very, very specific. You can walk into a cold spot and feel the symptoms come up at you within seconds, and when you leave it, they will resolve or reduce to a residual level very quickly. So it is a question, therefore, of working by walking into a cold spot to investigate it, walking out of it, walking around it, and in and out of it from different directions. Next. Now, this general set of perceptions may be sufficiently strong that you can actually measure a physical temperature drop even when you have accounted for other environmental factors which might make that cold spot feel cold. So this is the human experience side of it, but it is also a physical side. So the question arises, can you measure this with a thermometer? The answer is you can, but you can't always get an accurate reading, and you can't always find that you get a depression of temperature within a cold spot. So where have I got to? This business of cold spots, feeling cold, but not necessarily being cold, is part of that preternatural experience. And that is linked to the phenomena. Actually, people are really quite good at sensing changes in temperature because they can feel, on going from one room to another, the environment, the sense of temperature in this room is different from that of the other room. It may be a bit cooler, a bit damper, a bit hotter, or a bit drier. So that is something that people are actually good at. You can sense this to about an accuracy of approximately 3 degrees or so, which is the same as a usual kind of bog standard thermometer. There's no particular mystery about this because an ordinary thermometer is designed for ordinary purposes, and for a human purpose of feeling whether or not a room is hot or cold, then it will do. So therefore, to investigate cold spots, we need to use far more accurate thermometers. And obviously that means that they need to be far more costly because the temperature drops that we might expect in a cold spot are small to moderate. Although, having said that, it is possible to measure, as I have done, up to a 10 degrees centigrade drop. Now that is very significant. Now, with a 10 degree physical temperature drop, or a significant one, you then have to think in terms of, okay, you've got a cold spot. It has 3 dimensions. So you can think about it in terms of a cylinder, approximately, which would enclose a human body. So it also has a height, of course, and therefore you can think of that amount of cold air, and therefore the energy that would produce it, a bit like a refrigerator, and say, okay, if I wanted to cool that air, how much energy would I use? And the answer to that is could be as much as a large fridge freezer. The reason being that a fridge freezer is insulated, of course, but a cold spot isn't. So it has to maintain its depression in temperature from the air that surrounds it. Therefore, it requires more energy. Now, that energy might constitute a physical driving force for the phenomena itself, which may in turn be used to partially or fully produce a physical point of contact or source of information or materialization, an apparition, in other words. So, depending on the observer's psychic sensitivity, cold spots may be observed, detected, or perceived at a distance, including from behind walls or other structures, leading to a working hypothesis that cold spots have a psychic hinterland around them. Now, I've often found that I can sense them in buildings from the street, and then, on going into the building, walk around the building to find exactly the location of the cold spot that I'd sensed from outside the building. I'm not the only one who can do this, but it does take a bit of time to be able to latch up the skills involved, because otherwise you wouldn't necessarily be able to equate one thing from another. The bad feeling on sensing of a cold spot from outside a building with a particular room inside it. I mean, I did do this for a friend of mine, not sure I should name her specifically, but it was it was a building called 60 Coleraine Court. Now, some here may know who lived there at one time, but I was able to do that, for example, and I'd never been there with this person. And I was able to point at the building and say, there, you have a cold spot in that room at a particular place. And my friend said, yes, how did you know that? The answer is, because I sensed it. There have also been other occasions, great many, when I've been able to do the same thing. So you can sense these things from inside buildings. So that has to be a psychic matter, because it can't be a physical matter as far as I know, because you can't detect that with a thermometer. I'm not sure whether you could detect it with any other form of instrumentation, not yet anyway. The only other thing that you could use possibly would be an EMF meter, but there would be a lot of EMF flying around within buildings these days, Wi-Fi and mobile phones and so on. So, we now get into a bit more of the cold spot type of phenomena and syndrome. So depending on the observer's psychic sensitivity, there may or may not be the presence of a person associated with a cold spot. Now, that could be something to do with an actual person, or it could be an animal or a relationship between an animal or a person and an object. You don't know unless you actually take the step of going into the cold spot and being able to try to sense it or the person. And therefore, what you need to do is you need to try to make contact. Now, that can only really be done through mediumistic means. And therefore, this introduces a different dynamic into these sorts of investigations into ghost hunting and paranormal investigation, which is one of the reasons why I think that psychics and mediums can be useful in paranormal investigation, because they can tell you whether or not there is something within a cold spot, or whether the cold spot is of interest, or whether it's just sort of remnant psychical energy that is not particularly active. But how would you know unless you investigate it? So this is the point. You need to try to make contact, and you do that by standing within the cold spot and seeing what you can sense, opening your mind and seeing what comes through to you. When you do that, you may feel very little, or you may feel a great deal, or it may be a question of images and thoughts and emotions may pour in through your mind. So you need to filter them and you need to analyze them. And this occurs in a short period of time, although it can be extensive in the sense that, once this communication may be started, it may be difficult to stop, and it may continue even when you move out of the cold spot. As I say, the data can be transmitted at different rates, and you can try and shut it down or try and elicit it. But the important thing here is firstly, can you establish communication? Is it possible? Then what kind of communication it is. And thirdly, what happens as a result of that? Now, there are two things here. Firstly, if you're dealing with sort of a remnant psychical energy, then you might just be dealing with some sort of stone tape phenomena. Stone tape being the ability of various human affairs, particularly tragic and traumatic ones, to leave an imprint on a psychical ether, which would be the environment, the building, the stone, as it were, of a building. And therefore, somebody who is a psychic sensitive can come along and you can pick up on that, you read it, and therefore you have these impressions. So far, that isn't necessarily anything to do with discarnate spirits yet, in the sense that humans, living and dead, can do this. One of the things that I've always noticed is that if you are in, say, a queue, doesn't matter for what, buy a train ticket, a cup of coffee or whatever, you get the impression that there's someone behind you in the queue. You don't know how they got there, but you know they are there. Maybe it's because you missed clues. You couldn't see them come up behind you. Maybe you didn't hear them, or perhaps you did, but it was at a subliminal level. So the point is that you need to figure that out. Is it true? Is there someone behind you? Now, if you turn round to look, you find that there usually is. So how did you know that they were there? Was that picking up on subtle subliminal bits and pieces, as Sherlock Holmes might? Or is it a sort of psychic antenna twitching there? So the thing is that you can look at this either way. So it can be a stone tape recording that you're picking up on. It could possibly be subliminal, or it could be a ghost in that sense. But you don't know. If you're standing in a cold spot, you have to try and figure these things out, which is why you need to explore. And that's why you need to try to make contact, and why you need to make sense of the contact that you might be able to make. If the cold spot is just remnant psychical energy, as stone tape recording it might be, that could be the lowest level on the rung of the ladder of sort of survival, if you want to look at things in that way. Then that can be equated with sort of static hauntings. Here we go. So you could have static hauntings associated with some of this remnant energy, the classic thing of being a watcher in the corner, the typical sort of stone tape type phenomena. Or on the other hand, you could have a more intelligent type of haunting, which would be which would constitute a greater degree of communication. So you might be able to get sense impression data, you might be able to figure out who that is, you might be able to ask for a name, and you might be able to also ask for the person within the cold spot, assuming there is one, to move on request or whatever. So that is another sort of level that you can take this thing to, but what it really point of view. I would always recommend using instruments as well to see what can be obtained to try to bridge the gap between the mediumistic side and the instrumental side. So the use of things like data logging, data and humidity logging instruments. So you measure the temperature and humidity and see if there's any change within the cold spot, and EMF and so on, and also keep an audio log running so that you can see if you're going to pick up any EVPs as well as the result of the session. It's also important to be able to see what's going on as well. So if you can make a video record, that's brilliant. So these are the types of cold spots now. The static ones that I've been talking about, which are largely remnant energy, cold stone tape type phenomena, or there are the other sort, which will be the ones that move. So the static stone tape ones are more associated with a static haunting of a place rather than a person, and generally speaking don't move. There are the dynamic ones which can and do move and might move on request. So again, this links back to the ability to communicate and therefore to engage in an intelligent communication with the person that is within the cold spot, assuming there is one. And the test for that is, can you communicate? Do you get sense impression data or not? So the dynamic cold spots are those that are associated with the presence of entities or one sort or another, and they are also the sort of cold spots that are often generated in the seance room when mediums, in particular with their sitters, of course, are in contact with the spirit from the other side. So the two together mean that it's again tying things in. The operation of a seance led by a medium in the seance room and the phenomena that can occur. Again, there have been many people over the years who investigated this, and significant drops in temperature during seance sessions have been recorded, and there's a lot of good evidence for that. So that's a form of cold spot, and it's one that is generated specifically through the activity of the seance. So cold spots are also associated with apparitions, either full or partial, and this is the bridge between a cold spot and a discarnate person. So you can have an apparition, which is a cold spot, and a cold spot can also be, in a sense, an apparition, and that's my point here. Because coming back to this business of the energy involved, you could look at the energy being sucked out of a cold spot. That cold air could provide the energy for a materialization of a spirit, of an apparition, perhaps. There'd be quite a bit of energy involved, but how you would make the transition or translation between a column of cold air and a person, and how one drives the other, is something that we've got to continue to investigate from a scientific point of view, and hopefully we'll find out how and exactly why that works. So these sorts of cold spots, the dynamic ones, are associated, as I said, with what can happen in the seance room, and also with intelligent hauntings that tend to be wrapped around people rather than places. Now, the most complicated form of cold spot are these bilocational or bimodal ones, where there may be a static cold spot or there may be a dynamic one, but they appear to be the same or linked to the same individual in some way, shape or form. Also, if you have more than one cold spot that appears to be in association with the same kind of ghost or apparition, how's that possible? Because normally in ordinary life we can't bilocate, can't be in two places at once, and therefore if you think in normal rational terms about this, how could a ghost be in two places at once if they're relatively the same as us in terms of they're just people that survive bodily death? Well, the answer is perhaps to be found in the idea of the cold spot and stone tape link, in the sense that if you leave an impression on the ether through small accretion of little acts or one big act, which would be something which would be traumatic or whatever, high emotional content, then there could be more than one cold spot produced by that, because there could be more than one set of activities or actions that could be etched into the psychical ether. Therefore, there could be more than one cold spot associated with a particular presence. Now, how you find out what's going on is very difficult, and I have been involved in various investigations where we've explored these sorts of things. So you can have a haunting type phenomena where you've got a presence in a cold spot. You can have a number of cold spots, and they relate to certain key presences of individuals. Some moving, some don't move. Some are associated with spirits that move. Others are sort of static watchers from the side of a wall or whatever, things like that. But it's very complicated, and it takes a great deal of time to sort all of this out. So you need to think about some of the techniques I've mentioned in order to be able to do this. But it can be done, and I've done it. So I think that's more or less it. So if there are any questions, that would be great. And thank you very much.
So, Ciaran, thank you very much for that wonderful talk. That was really engaging. Actually, I was certainly in the zone and firing up questions in the chat box there, just as many other people are too. And there are certainly many questions for you. Caroline, do you want to have a read through them and see what Ciaran can pluck from them?